Why did prisons in the U.S. do executions at midnight? At 1 minute before midnight, some of the most guarded buildings in America became unnaturally quiet. The talking stopped first. Then the radios lowered. Then the footsteps slowed. Inside administrative offices, phones remained active. Lawyers were still calling judges. Clerks were checking documents. Witnesses were waiting in separate rooms. Guards stood in hallways pretending calm. Somewhere behind locked doors, a condemned prisoner understood that every sound now mattered. For decades, prisons in parts of the United States often scheduled executions at or just after midnight. To many people, it seemed sinister. Why choose the darkest hour of the day? Why not morning, when courts were open and the public was awake? Why not afternoon, when the state could at least be seen carrying out its own decision? The answer begins not with mystery, but with machinery. Prisons are institutions built on routine, timing, and control. Every meal, every movement, every count, every lock turn exists on schedule. When the state decided to take a life, it often approached that act the same way it approached everything else, through procedure. But procedure, in this case, created a ritual so cold that it still unsettles people now. And what happened in those final hours before midnight was often more revealing than the execution itself. If you appreciate serious stories like this, subscribe now and comment where you are watching from. To understand midnight executions, you first have to understand how prisons think. A prison does not measure time the way ordinary life does. Outside the walls, time is flexible. Breakfast can happen late. A meeting can be moved. A person can choose to stay awake, sleep in, or walk outside at sunset. Inside prison walls, time belongs to the institution. Wake-up calls happen at fixed hours. Doors open when ordered. Meals arrive when scheduled. Recreation begins and ends on command. Even silence can be regulated. This obsession with structure is not accidental. Administrators know that predictability reduces conflict. In a place holding hundreds or thousands of people against their will, routine becomes one of the strongest tools of control. That mentality extended into executions. Officials did not want unpredictability. They did not want daytime crowds, chaotic scheduling, interrupted prison operations, or uncertainty over whether a legal warrant remained valid. They wanted an hour when most inmates were locked down, fewer visitors were present, and internal movement had nearly stopped. Midnight offered something prisons value deeply: stillness. But stillness for the institution meant dread for the person waiting in a cell. Because when an execution is set for midnight, every minute of the evening becomes a countdown. And that countdown could stretch longer than many people realize. Once an execution date was set, the condemned prisoner entered a different kind of time. Death row already operated under severe restrictions in many states. Small cells. Limited movement. Heavy surveillance. Recreation often alone in fenced enclosures. Meals passed through slots. Visits tightly controlled. Years could pass in this environment while appeals moved slowly through courts. Then one day, a date would be chosen. From that moment, life changed again. Additional officers might be assigned nearby. Property could be inventoried. Legal access intensified. Chaplains were notified. Medical checks became more frequent. Security searches increased. Administrators reviewed contingency plans. Even the smallest details, clothing, transport routes, witness lists, equipment readiness, could be checked repeatedly. For the prisoner, ordinary prison monotony was replaced by acute anticipation. Imagine knowing the exact day the state intends to kill you. Imagine counting not years, but hours. Some men spent their final days speaking constantly, trying to fill silence with conversation. Others withdrew entirely. Some wrote letters. Some reconciled with family. Some denied guilt to the end. Some confessed only when nothing else remained to lose. And hanging over all of it was midnight. Not sunrise. Not afternoon. Midnight. A time associated with endings, darkness, and finality. Even when officials chose it for practical reasons, the psychological meaning was impossible to ignore. One of the strongest reasons for midnight scheduling was legal timing. Execution warrants often authorized the sentence on a specific date. That legal wording mattered. If the warrant said the execution could occur on Tuesday, prison officials needed to ensure it happened within the lawful window. Scheduling the execution just after 12 a.m. Tuesday meant the state began at the earliest clear moment of that date. No waiting until evening and risking delays. No technical issue consuming valuable hours. No concern that a late court filing could push the process past midnight into the next day. Administrators prefer margins of safety. Midnight created one. But there was another layer to this. Even while prisons prepared to act at midnight, lawyers for the condemned often fought until the last possible minute. Emergency appeals, constitutional claims, clemency requests, competency challenges, procedural objections, many cases remained active right up to the scheduled hour. So prisons wanted two things at once: maximum time for courts to intervene, maximum control if they did not. That combination made the final evening extraordinarily tense. Phones could ring with a stay order at 11:52 p.m. or with a denial at 11:58 p.m. In some cases, the difference between life and death came down to minutes. The public often focuses on the execution chamber, but the final hours in the cell may be the most haunting part of the story. Meals were offered, sometimes accepted, sometimes ignored. Final visits could occur under supervision. Attorneys moved in and out. Spiritual advisors might pray, read scripture, or simply sit in silence. Then there were the pauses. Long stretches when nothing happened except waiting. A prisoner might listen for footsteps in the corridor. Every key turn sounded important. Every voice outside the cell could signal new information. Some hoped for a last-minute court order. Others no longer believed one would come. Some experienced visible fear. Others appeared calm, though no one can know what they truly felt. Correctional officers, too, were affected. Many had supervised the same prisoner for years. They knew habits, moods, routines, and family names. They were expected to remain professional while participating in a process that would end a life before dawn. That emotional contradiction rarely appears in headlines. Yet it lived in those corridors night after night. And while all of this happened inside one cell block, the rest of the prison could feel it too. Prisons are places where information travels without permission. A change in staffing levels. An unusual movement of supervisors. Restricted hallway access. Extra radio traffic. Meals delivered differently. Even if officials tried to limit details, many inmates understood when an execution was near. On death row tiers, the awareness could be intense. Some prisoners knew the condemned man personally. They had spent years shouting through bars, sharing legal updates, discussing families, arguing, surviving. Now one of them was being taken toward the end of the line. Some inmates yelled encouragement. Some prayed aloud. Some banged on doors in protest. Some remained silent because fear had already reached them. Imagine hearing another man's final night through concrete walls while knowing your own date might come later. This was one of the least discussed realities of the death penalty. Punishment was not felt only by one person. It spread through the tier. And midnight made that atmosphere sharper. Because darkness amplified sound. A single door closing could carry like thunder. Midnight also served a public order purpose. Executions could attract protesters, media crews, victims' families, legal observers, religious groups, and curious onlookers. During daylight, those gatherings were more visible and harder to manage. At night, roads were quieter. Access points easier to secure. Fewer unrelated visitors moved through surrounding areas. Internal prison operations were reduced. Administrators often viewed the late hour as efficient. Critics saw something else. They argued that darkness hid the act from ordinary civic life. If the state was going to use its highest power, they believed it should not happen while most citizens slept. That criticism cut deep because it challenged the image of justice itself. Was an execution a solemn public act? Or an administrative task best handled when fewer people were watching? The answer differed depending on who was asked. But even supporters of capital punishment sometimes acknowledged the unsettling optics of midnight. Because whatever language officials used, it still looked like the state preferred shadows. When the final legal barriers fell, the choreography began. Witnesses were escorted in. Victims' relatives in one section. Media representatives in another. Officials in designated positions. Medical personnel or trained staff prepared according to the method being used under state law at that time. The condemned prisoner was brought in under guard. By then, the room often became quieter than any courtroom. No dramatic speeches. No music. No shouting. Just procedure. Identity confirmed. Orders read. Last statement offered. Then the mechanism of execution. Different states used different methods across history: hanging, electrocution, gas, firing squad, lethal injection, but all required one thing prisons valued above all else: control of the environment. Witnesses saw only what officials allowed them to see. Angles were limited. Timing was controlled. Curtains opened and closed on command. This is another reason midnight fit so naturally into the prison mindset. It was a controlled hour for a controlled act. But control does not erase human reality. Many witnesses later described the silence as the most disturbing part. Over time, methods changed, but the institutional logic often remained. In earlier eras, electrocutions required technical readiness and trained staff. Gas chambers involved elaborate preparation. Lethal injection introduced new medicalized language and procedures. Each change promised something cleaner, calmer, more humane. Yet behind every method stood the same question: how does a state deliberately end life while preserving the appearance of order? Midnight helped maintain that appearance. The prison could continue normal operations the next morning. Paperwork would be completed. Shift changes conducted. Meals served. Counts performed. Another day would begin. This may be one of the most unsettling truths of prison systems. They are designed to continue. A person could be declared dead shortly after midnight, and breakfast service would still roll at dawn. Institutions absorb extraordinary acts into ordinary routine. That ability keeps them functioning. It can also make them seem emotionally distant. Often forgotten in these discussions are the staff required to carry them out. Wardens signed authorizations and managed scrutiny. Officers escorted prisoners they may have known for years. Medical personnel faced ethical controversies. Clerks documented times and signatures. Some employees described executions as simply part of the job. Others later spoke of insomnia, stress, drinking, recurring memories, or emotional numbness. Midnight scheduling meant many left prison grounds in the earliest hours of morning, driving home while the rest of the city slept. No applause. No closure ceremony. Just empty roads and sunrise. That private aftermath rarely enters public debate, but it matters. Because systems do not act alone. People inside them act. And those people carry memories long after the paperwork is filed. As years passed, many states changed execution schedules or halted executions entirely. Some shifted to evening hours. Some faced legal battles over methods. Some abolished capital punishment. Others retained it but revised procedures. The midnight tradition weakened in many places. Not because midnight became inconvenient. Because broader questions became harder to ignore. What if the wrong person is executed? What if the method fails? What does decades on death row do to the mind? What does repeated participation do to staff? What does it mean for a democracy to schedule death as routine administration? These questions reached beyond time slots and prison policy. They reached into the moral center of the system itself. And once those questions are asked seriously, midnight starts to look less like a scheduling choice and more like a symbol. So why did prisons in the U.S. do executions at midnight? Because midnight provided legal clarity. Because it allowed last-minute appeals while preserving the date on the warrant. Because most inmates were locked down and prison movement was minimal. Because roads were quieter, operations easier, and public disruption lower. Because institutions often choose efficiency over symbolism. But symbolism arrived anyway. Midnight turned punishment into ritual. It placed the state's most final act at the edge of public consciousness, after one day had ended, before the next had fully begun. A time when most people were asleep. A time when walls seemed thicker. A time when silence carried farther. And perhaps that is why the practice still lingers in memory. Not because midnight changed the sentence, but because it revealed how power prefers to move when no one is looking. But the story of midnight executions does not end inside prison walls. Because some of the most decisive moments happened far away, in court chambers, governors' offices, and judges' homes, while the prison waited in suspended tension. On execution nights, legal teams often raced against time. Appeals that had taken months to prepare could be decided in hours. Emergency motions were typed, faxed, phoned in, argued, denied, revived, and denied again. Every minute after sunset carried greater pressure. Inside the prison, officials needed certainty. Outside the prison, the law often delivered uncertainty. That created one of the strangest scenes in American justice, a fully prepared institution waiting for a phone call that could stop everything. Guards stood ready. Witnesses were seated. The prisoner may already have said goodbye. Then the line rang. Sometimes it was a stay. Sometimes it was a rejection. Sometimes it was another delay. And when the answer came late enough, midnight no longer felt like a symbolic hour. It felt like a battlefield between bureaucracy and mercy. Before instant digital communication became common, those final orders could arrive in dramatic fashion. Court clerks reading rulings over the phone. Faxes feeding paper inch by inch. Attorneys racing through gates carrying signed filings. Governors consulting advisors deep into the night. Prison administrators learned to expect chaos disguised as procedure. One delay could reset transportation plans, witness management, staffing, and security posture. If a stay arrived after the prisoner had already been moved, the emotional shock could be severe for everyone involved. Imagine being escorted toward death, hearing straps prepared, then being told to turn around and go back to your cell. That happened more than once in American history. For some prisoners, it happened multiple times. Those experiences left scars that were difficult to measure. Supporters of the death penalty saw them as unavoidable consequences of due process. Critics saw them as psychological torment created by the system itself. Either way, midnight intensified everything. Because when hope appears at 11:58 p.m., it carries a force no ordinary hour can match. If no stay came, movement began. The prisoner was usually searched, restrained according to policy, and escorted under guard. Routes were chosen carefully. Doors opened one at a time. Hallways were cleared. Radios stayed active. Even in modern facilities, prisons rely on layers of steel and sequence. One gate must close before another opens. One zone must be secure before the next begins. This process can feel mechanical from the outside. Inside it, every second stretches. The condemned person often understood each sound: hinges, locks, keys, commands, footsteps. Those sounds marked irreversible progress. Some prisoners walked steadily. Some needed assistance. Some spoke to officers. Some remained silent. Some used the journey to deliver final apologies or declarations of innocence. For officers, professionalism was expected. Emotion was not. Yet many later admitted those walks stayed with them for years. Because escorting a man to confinement is one thing. Escorting him to death is another. Then there were the families. Much public debate focused on law and punishment, but execution nights also brought together people carrying grief in very different forms. Victims' relatives sometimes came hoping for closure, justice, or simply an end to years of appeals. Families of the condemned often came carrying shame, loyalty, sorrow, confusion, or all of it at once. Both groups entered the same prison under separate arrangements, often kept apart entirely. Both waited for the same clock. Some victims' families later said the execution brought peace. Others said it changed nothing. Some families of the condemned maintained the prisoner's innocence until the end. Others condemned the crime but still loved the person. These human contradictions did not fit clean slogans. Midnight compressed them into one room, one event, one irreversible outcome. And once the process began, nobody could step outside it. Witnesses who described executions often mentioned how ordinary the rooms looked. Not theatrical. Not dramatic. Sometimes sterile. Sometimes outdated. Sometimes surprisingly small. That banality mattered. Many expected to witness a moment of obvious historical gravity. Instead they encountered fluorescent lighting, institutional furniture, and officials reading scripted lines. The gap between the meaning of the act and the appearance of the room could be deeply unsettling. Then came the final statement. Some prisoners apologized. Some thanked family. Some attacked the system verbally. Some quoted scripture. Some insisted on innocence. Some said almost nothing. And then, depending on the era and state, the method was carried out. What followed could be swift, prolonged, controversial, quiet, or visibly troubling depending on circumstances and procedure. No two witnesses processed it the same way. But many agreed on one thing: afterward, the silence felt heavier than before. When the execution ended, another ritual began. A spokesperson would confirm the time of death. Media outside prepared breaking reports. Attorneys issued statements. Families departed into the night carrying emotions no press release could summarize. Inside, prison staff completed documentation, times, signatures, inventory, transfer procedures, witness logs. Even in death, administration continued. This is where midnight again served institutional interests. By dawn, much of the operational disruption was already over. The prison could return to schedule with remarkable speed. Breakfast carts rolled. Counts resumed. Shift supervisors briefed replacements. To outsiders, that may sound cold. To institutions, it is survival. Prisons are built to continue functioning regardless of what occurred hours earlier. And that ability to normalize extraordinary events is part of what made midnight executions possible for so long. For those still on death row, the night did not end when the witnesses left. They had heard movement. They had sensed tension. Then, eventually, stillness. In some prisons, inmates could tell from the atmosphere whether the execution had gone forward. The tier became quieter afterward. Some men prayed for the executed prisoner. Some feared their own date would come next. Some hardened themselves emotionally because they believed softness was dangerous in that environment. Years on death row already imposed intense psychological strain. Seeing neighbors removed one by one added another layer. This was punishment by proximity. The state may have sentenced one person, but the emotional shockwaves spread through the unit. And each midnight reminded others that the system's schedule still included them. Then came another force that changed the national conversation: doubt. As wrongful convictions were uncovered, especially through DNA evidence, public confidence in death penalty systems was shaken. Cases once treated as settled proved flawed. Witnesses had lied. Confessions were coerced. Defense work had failed. Evidence had been mishandled. That did not automatically end capital punishment. But it changed how many people viewed it. If mistakes were possible, then procedure alone could not guarantee justice. A midnight schedule, once defended as efficient, now looked to some like a machine moving too confidently. Questions grew louder. What if the wrong person had already been executed? What if future certainty was impossible? What if no amount of timing, paperwork, or ritual could solve that problem? Those questions reached beyond prisons and into legislatures, courts, and public conscience. Some states abolished the death penalty entirely. Others imposed moratoriums. Some retained it but struggled with legal challenges over methods, drug access, staffing, or constitutional standards. Executions became less frequent in many parts of the country. Midnight scheduling declined in significance as systems changed. Yet the old image remains powerful, a prison awake after dark, preparing for death while the city sleeps. Why does that image endure? Because it reveals something fundamental about modern institutions. When confronted with morally immense decisions, they often respond with logistics. Choose a time. Assign staff. Secure the perimeter. Prepare the room. Complete the form. But human beings do not experience morality as logistics. They experience it as memory, grief, fear, relief, anger, and doubt. That tension never disappeared. So the deeper question is not only why prisons chose midnight. It is why midnight seemed acceptable. Perhaps because darkness creates emotional distance. Perhaps because schedules can disguise the weight of what they contain. Perhaps because when responsibility is spread across judges, governors, wardens, officers, technicians, and clerks, no single person appears to own the moment completely. Yet someone always remembers. The officer who made the walk. The family member who watched through glass. The lawyer who waited by the phone. The prisoner in the next cell listening through concrete. The reporter who stepped into cold air after announcing a time of death. Midnight did not erase responsibility. It only framed it. And that may be the lasting truth of midnight executions in America. They were never truly about the clock. They were about how power prefers order, how institutions seek silence, and how societies try to place unbearable acts inside manageable procedures. But some acts never become manageable. No matter what hour they happen. No matter how many forms are signed. No matter how quiet the hallway becomes. Because when the clock strikes 12 inside a prison, time may move forward. But memory often does not. Some stories end when the gates close. Others stay with you long after the silence returns. The history of midnight executions was never only about prisons or punishment. It was about power, procedure, and the questions a nation leaves unanswered. If this story made you think, share your thoughts below. And if you want more deep documentaries like this, subscribe and stay with us. Until next time, stay aware, stay curious, and remember, history often speaks loudest in the places built to keep it quiet.